I remember the color of the sky when they came. It was that particular shade of rust orange that Agri World 17 always wore at dusk, when the harvester machines shut down and the dust settled across the grain fields like a funeral shroud. I was walking the perimeter of Hab Block Tertius, low stick between my lips, las rifle slung across my shoulder in that casual way that veteran PDF troopers carry their weapons after 20 years of uneventful service. The Emperor protects, we always said. On backwater worlds like ours, tucked away in the ass end of the Imperium where nothing ever happened, those words were more habit than faith. I should have known better. I should have remembered that the galaxy is vast and cruel, and that the Emperor's light does not reach everywhere, and that there are things in the darkness between stars that hunger for human suffering, the way a man hungers for water in the desert. The attack came without warning. One moment I was grinding the low stick beneath my boot heel, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. The next, the sky tore open. I don't know how else to describe it. Reality itself seemed to split, and through that wound in the world came vessels that moved like knives cutting through fabric. They were sleek and terrible, curved like the spine of some predatory beast, all dark metal and edges that hurt to look at. No sirens sounded, no voxcasters crackled with warning. The administratum officials who managed our world probably never even knew what was happening before they died. I stood there, frozen, watching those ships descend with a grace that was obscene, that spoke of intelligence and purpose and deliberate cruelty. They were beautiful in the way a venomous serpent is beautiful, in the way a razor blade catches the light. The air filled with screaming, not human screaming, not at first. The ships made sounds as they moved, high-pitched wails that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and stab directly into the brain. I dropped my las rifle. I didn't mean to, but my hands stopped working properly, fingers spasming as that sound burrowed into my skull like a parasite. Around me, other PDF troopers were falling to their knees, clutching their heads, some of them weeping, some of them laughing in that hysterical way that means the mind has broken and fled inward to escape what it cannot comprehend. I tried to run. The Emperor forgive me. I tried to run. My legs pumped beneath me, boots hammering against the rockcrete of the Hab Block's outer wall, lungs burning as I gulped air that tasted of ozone and something sweeter, something that reminded me of incense burned at funeral rites. They came from the sky like falling angels, except there was nothing holy about them. They wore armor that seemed to be made from shadows and blades, all sharp angles and cruel curves, decorated with hooks and spikes that served no practical purpose except to intimidate and horrify. Their faces were hidden behind helmets that resembled the skulls of predatory birds, eye lenses glowing with a sickly luminescence that reminded me of deep-water creatures I'd seen in the pict reels during basic training. They moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible, flowing across the ground like liquid darkness, and in their hands they carried weapons that hummed with malevolent energy. I saw Trooper Hendricks cut in half by a blade that seemed to be made from solidified night. I saw Corporal Venn pulled apart by hooks and chains. His screams cut short as his vocal cords were severed, but his eyes remaining horribly, impossibly alive as pieces of him were dragged away. I saw things I cannot describe, things that my mind has tried to forget but that return to me every time I close my eyes in this place of eternal torment. A net fell over me, and it was not made of rope or metal but of something that tingled against my skin like electricity, that tightened automatically as I struggled, that seemed almost alive in its eagerness to bind me. I fell hard, tasted blood and dust, felt bones crack as I hit the ground. Hands grabbed me, thin, elegant hands that were far stronger than they appeared, hands that wore gauntlets decorated with tiny spikes that dug into my flesh through my uniform. I was lifted, carried, thrown into the belly of one of those screaming ships, along with dozens of other prisoners, men and women from my regiment, civilians from the hab blocks, children still clutching the toys they'd been playing with when the raid began. We were piled together like meat in a processing plant, and as the ship's doors sealed shut and we began to rise, I caught one last glimpse of Agri World 17 through a narrow viewport. Fires burned across the grain fields. Bodies hung from the harvester machines like grotesque decorations. The chapel where I'd taken my wedding vows 40 years ago was collapsing in on itself, the golden aquila atop its spire melting in flames that burned in colors no fire should burn. The journey was darkness and pain. They kept us in holds that were too small, crushed together so tightly that we couldn't sit or lie down, could only stand in our own filth as the ship traveled through whatever hellish realm these creatures called home. There was no light except the occasional flicker from what might have been viewing portals or might have been eyes watching us from the shadows. The air was thick and hot and smelled of spices and decay, of perfumes and excrement mixed together until I couldn't tell where one scent ended and another began. People died in that hold. I felt their bodies go slack against me, felt the warmth drain from their flesh as death claimed them, and there was nothing to do but keep standing, keep breathing, keep existing in that suffocating darkness. Some people prayed. I heard the whispered litanies of the Imperial creed echoing through the hold, desperate invocations to the Emperor to deliver us, to strike down our captors, to grant us the mercy of death. The Emperor did not answer. Perhaps he could not hear us in whatever twisted dimension these ships traveled through. Perhaps he simply did not care about the fates of a few hundred souls from an insignificant Agri world on the outer rim of his vast domain. Time lost meaning in that darkness. It might have been hours or days or weeks before the ship finally stopped, and the doors opened, and we were dragged out into a new kind of hell. I had thought the universe held no greater suffering than what I'd already endured. I had thought myself already broken, already resigned to whatever fate awaited. I was wrong. The Emperor forgive me. I was so terribly, horribly wrong. The place they brought us to was unlike anything I had ever seen or imagined. It was a city, if such a word can be applied to that impossible architecture, that sprawling nightmare of spires and bridges and platforms that seemed to grow from some massive structure floating in a void of purple-black nothingness. The buildings were constructed from materials that shifted and changed as I looked at them. Surfaces that might have been metal or stone or something organic, covered in carvings and sculptures that depicted acts of cruelty so elaborate and creative that I could not comprehend their purpose. Everywhere there were lights, not the clean illumination of lumen strips or the warm glow of candles, but harsh, pulsing lights in shades of violet and crimson and deep blue that hurt to look at, that seemed to reach inside my skull and tug at something fundamental. We were sorted like livestock. The raiders who had captured us removed their helmets, and I saw their faces for the first time, and I wished to the golden throne that I never had. They were beautiful and terrible in equal measure, features so perfect they seemed sculpted rather than born, skin pale as moonlight, eyes that were solid orbs of darkness or contained pupils shaped like diamonds or stars. But their beauty was a mockery, a corruption of what beauty should be, because when they smiled I saw teeth filed to points, and when they laughed I heard sounds that spoke of pleasure taken from pain inflicted. They moved among us with casual grace, examining us the way a merchant might examine goods in a market, running those thin fingers across our faces and bodies, sometimes cutting away bits of clothing or flesh to inspect what lay beneath. They spoke to each other in a language that sounded like broken glass and distant screaming, a tongue that made my ears ache and my vision blur. I was separated from the others, pulled from the crowd by one of these creatures who wore robes of deep purple, decorated with still-living faces sewn into the fabric, mouths opening and closing in silent agony. This one studied me for a long moment, head cocked to one side like a curious bird, then spoke in Gothic that was heavily accented but perfectly understandable. This one has years, it said. Voice neither male nor female, but something between. This one has memories. This one will provide adequate amusement. I was dragged away, hauled through corridors that seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied geometry, past rooms where I glimpsed things that made me squeeze my eyes shut and pray for blindness. I heard screaming echoing from every direction, human voices raised in every possible variation of agony and terror and despair. The sound never stopped. It formed a background chorus to everything, a symphony of suffering that these creatures had composed over centuries or millennia. They brought me to a chamber that might have been an arena or a theater, a vast space with seating arranged in tiers around a central floor that was stained dark with what could only be old blood. The creature who had claimed me pushed me forward, and I stumbled out onto that floor, legs shaking, heart hammering so hard I thought it might tear free from my chest. The seating areas were filled with more of them, dozens or hundreds of those perfect, terrible faces, all turned toward me with expressions of anticipation and hunger. They wore elaborate costumes and armor, each one unique, each one decorated with trophies that I tried not to look at too closely. Some held goblets that steamed with liquids that might or might not have been wine. Some were attended by slaves, humans, I realized with horror. Humans who had been here so long that they had forgotten how to be human, who crawled and groveled and smiled with empty eyes. What followed was pain. I cannot describe it properly, cannot find words adequate to convey the experience. They hurt me in ways I did not know were possible, ways that required tools and devices I cannot begin to explain. They cut and burned and broke and poisoned and healed and began again. They asked me no questions, sought no information. This was not interrogation or torture in any traditional sense. This was art to them, performance, entertainment. They took pleasure from my suffering the way a normal human might take pleasure from music or fine food. I screamed until my voice failed. I begged until I had no words left. I prayed until the names of the Emperor and the saints became meaningless sounds. Time stretched and compressed, minutes feeling like hours, hours feeling like seconds. Sometimes I would black out from the pain, only to be revived by some chemical agent or psychic manipulation, denied even the escape of unconsciousness. Between sessions, for that is how I came to think of them. As sessions, as if there were some schedule or plan to my destruction, I was kept in a cell that was barely large enough to contain my body. The walls were rough and covered in some substance that itched where it touched my skin. There was no light, no sound except my own breathing, and the distant eternal screaming. They fed me occasionally, bowls of paste that tasted like ashes and copper, and I ate because some animal part of my brain still clung to survival even when death would have been mercy. I tried to keep track of time by counting the meals, but they were irregular, sometimes arriving in rapid succession, sometimes with what felt like days between. My sense of reality began to fracture. I started having conversations with people who weren't there, seeing visions of my wife and children who had died decades ago, reliving memories from my youth on Warhammer 40K, when life had been simple, and the greatest concern was whether the grain harvest would meet the administratum's tithes. The creature who had claimed me, I came to think of it as my tormentor, though there were others who participated in my sessions seemed particularly interested in my memories. It would ask questions while inflicting pain, wanting to know about my childhood, my military service, my family, my dreams. At first I refused to answer, clinging to some foolish notion of resistance. But pain has a way of stripping away dignity and defiance. Eventually, I told it everything it wanted to know, babbling confessions and reminiscences while it worked on my body with those terrible instruments. I described the first time I'd fired a las rifle during basic training, the satisfaction of hitting the target center mass. I described my wedding day, the way my wife had smiled when I'd placed the Aquila medallion around her neck. I described the birth of my daughter, that moment of pure joy when the midwife had placed the squalling infant in my arms, and I'd seen her tiny, perfect face. The creature seemed to savor these memories, drinking them in like wine, and I realized with dawning horror that it was feeding on more than just my physical pain. It was consuming my experiences, my emotions, the very substance of what made me human. Each memory I shared became tainted, corrupted, associated forever with the agony of the moment in which I'd spoken it. Now, when I try to remember my wife's smile, I also remember the hooks in my flesh. When I think of my daughter's birth, I feel the burning. They are stealing not just my present and future, but my past as well, taking everything I was and transforming it into fuel for their sick pleasures. I learned things about my captors during those sessions, fragments of information gleaned from their conversations and actions. They called themselves the Drukhari, though I had heard them referred to by another name in Imperial texts, the Dark Eldar, the fallen kin of the craft-world Eldar, creatures who had embraced cruelty and depravity as a way of life. They lived in this impossible city of Commorragh, a place that existed partly in real space and partly in the webway, hidden from the sight of the Imperium and the other powers that ruled the galaxy. They were ancient beyond human comprehension, individuals who had lived for thousands of years, sustained by the suffering they inflicted on others. Pain was not merely pleasure to them but sustenance, necessary for their survival, for they were slowly being devoured by some dark god they had birthed through their own excess. Every scream, every drop of blood, every moment of agony fed them and kept that god's hunger at bay for a little while longer. This knowledge did not make the suffering easier to bear. If anything, it made it worse, because it meant there was purpose behind my torment, reason and logic, however twisted and incomprehensible. I was not simply unlucky or in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was food, livestock, a resource to be harvested. My pain had meaning to them, even if it had none to me. I found myself wondering how many others had passed through this place, how many millions or billions of humans had been captured and brought to Commorragh over the millennia, how many had screamed themselves voiceless in arenas and torture chambers, while the Drukhari watched and fed and laughed. The Imperium teaches that human life is valuable, that each soul is precious in the eyes of the Emperor. But out here, beyond the borders of his domain, we were nothing more than cattle. The sessions continued. Sometimes I was alone with my tormentor. Sometimes there were audiences, crowds of Drukhari who watched and commented and placed wagers on how long I would last, on what sounds I would make, on whether I would beg or curse or pray. Sometimes I was brought before important figures, archons and homunculi, and other titles I did not understand, paraded as entertainment at their feasts and gatherings. I saw wonders and horrors in those halls, living sculptures that writhed in eternal agony, furniture constructed from still conscious beings, artwork made from human skin and bone arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. The wealth on display was obscene, treasures plundered from across the galaxy, relics and artifacts that would have made administratum officials weep with envy. But all of it was tainted, corrupted, transformed into expressions of cruelty and domination. I met other prisoners during my time in Commorragh, brief encounters in corridors or cells or arenas. Most were human, though I saw representatives of other species as well. Green-skinned orcs reduced to whimpering wrecks, Tau who had lost their optimism and faith in the greater good, even occasionally captured Astartes, stripped of their armor and power. We rarely spoke. What was there to say? We all knew what we were, what we had become. Some prisoners had been in Commorragh for years or decades, kept alive through the Drukhari's advanced technology and dark science, bodies rebuilt and restored only to be broken again. They moved through the corridors like ghosts, eyes hollow, souls long since fled even if their bodies persisted. I wondered how long before I would join them, before I would become one of those empty shells who no longer remembered that freedom had ever existed. My tormentor seemed displeased with my deterioration. It complained to others that I was going stale, that my suffering had lost its intensity, that my screams no longer carried the proper notes of anguish. This worried me more than anything else had, because I knew what happened to prisoners who no longer provided adequate entertainment. I had seen the disposal pits where useless flesh was thrown, the feeding pens where more exotic creatures were kept. I forced myself to scream louder, to beg more convincingly, to show fear and pain, even when I felt only numbness. It worked, at least for a while. My tormentor seemed satisfied, even pleased, and the sessions continued with renewed creativity. But something had changed inside me. Perhaps it was the numbness, the way pain had become so constant that it was almost background noise. Perhaps it was simple exhaustion, the mind's protective shutdown when confronted with too much trauma, or perhaps it was something else, some last stubborn ember of defiance that refused to be extinguished. I began to resist in small ways. I would not cry out immediately when the pain began. I would answer questions in monosyllables or not at all. I would close my eyes during sessions, denying them the sight of my expression. These were pitiful gestures, meaningless in the face of what was being done to me, but they were mine. They were choices I could make, actions I could control in a situation where everything else had been stripped away. My tormentor noticed. It grew angry, frustration bleeding through its usual cold detachment. The sessions became longer, more elaborate, as it tried to break through whatever wall I had managed to erect around myself. It brought in specialists, other Drukhari, with particular skills in inflicting suffering. It consulted with homunculi about new procedures and techniques. It even resorted to crude methods, beatings and starvation, as if simple brutality could succeed where artistry had failed. I endured it all. Not stoically, I was still screaming, still begging, still feeling every moment of agony, but with some core part of myself held separate and safe. I thought of it as a small room deep inside my mind, where the real me still lived, untouched by the horrors inflicted on the body I inhabited. Then came the day when my tormentor made a mistake. We were in the arena, another session before an audience, and it was using some device that sent waves of electricity through my nervous system, making my muscles spasm and my heart stutter in my chest. The crowd was growing bored. I could sense it, their attention wandering. My tormentor grew desperate, increased the device's power beyond safe levels, and suddenly I was seizing, body convulsing so hard that bones fractured, blood vessels rupturing behind my eyes. I felt myself dying, felt consciousness slipping away, and the small room inside my mind opened up, and I fell through it into blessed darkness. I woke in a different cell, smaller and darker than before. My body had been repaired, I realized, patched back together by the same medical technology that kept these creatures eternally young. But something was different. The repairs had been hasty, incomplete. I could feel places inside me that were still broken, systems that were not working properly. And, more than that, I could feel a change in my status. I was no longer valuable property. I had been allowed to die almost, and that meant I had failed as entertainment. I would be disposed of soon, thrown into the pits, or given to the creatures in the feeding pens, or simply left to expire in this cell and be forgotten. The knowledge filled me with something I had not felt in a long time. Not joy, not exactly, but a grim satisfaction. I had won, in my own small way. I had resisted until I broke their system, until they could no longer use me for their purposes. My death would serve no one's pleasure. It would be meaningless, wasteful, an admission of failure on their part. The thought made me smile in the darkness of that cell, lips cracking and bleeding from the expression, and I realized I was laughing, a sound that was halfway between humor and madness. Days passed, or what felt like days. No one came. The screaming from other parts of the complex continued, a constant reminder that I was just one prisoner among thousands or millions, that my small victory meant nothing in the larger scope of Commorragh's operations. I grew weaker. The repairs to my body were failing, breaking down, and there was no one to fix them again. Pain was my constant companion now, but it was a different kind of pain. The pain of a body slowly shutting down, rather than the deliberate infliction of torture. I preferred it. It was mine, natural, a sign that I was finally, truly dying. I thought about my life as I lay there in the darkness. 73 years I had lived before the raid on Agri World 17. Not a remarkable life by any measure. I had been a simple man, a farmer who joined the PDF because the pay was slightly better and the work less back-breaking. I had loved my wife with a quiet, steady devotion that never blazed bright but never flickered out. I had raised my daughter to be strong and faithful and kind. I had attended services at the chapel every 7th day, reciting the Imperial creed without truly contemplating its meaning. I had been content with my small corner of the Emperor's vast domain, asking nothing more than to live out my years in peace and die surrounded by family. The Drukhari had taken all of that from me. They had torn me from my home, tortured me for their amusement, broken my body, and tried to break my spirit. But as I lay dying in that cell, I realized they had also given me something. However, inadvertently, they had shown me the true nature of the galaxy beyond the Imperium's borders. They had revealed the depths of cruelty and darkness that existed in the universe, the powers that lurked in the spaces between stars, and in doing so, they had given meaning to the Emperor's eternal vigil, to the endless grinding machinery of the Imperium that I had once thought harsh and oppressive. The Imperium was terrible in its own way, grinding up individual lives in service of humanity's survival, but it existed to protect against things like this, against predators who saw humans as nothing more than prey. I wished I could send this knowledge back somehow, could warn the people of Agri World 17 about what awaited in the darkness. But I knew it was impossible. I was lost, forgotten, one more soul consumed by the galaxy's infinite cruelty. My name would not be recorded in any ledger or memorial. My sacrifice would be meaningless, unmarked, unremembered. I was nothing, and I had always been nothing. Just another number in the Administratum's records, another body to fill a PDF uniform, another screaming voice in Commorragh's eternal chorus of suffering. But I had resisted. That small room inside my mind, that core of self that I had protected even as everything else was stripped away, remained intact. The Drukhari had failed to completely consume me, failed to extract every last drop of suffering from my existence. My final moments would be my own, private, denied to them. It was a small victory, insignificant in any objective sense, but it was mine. I clung to it as my breathing became more labored, as my heartbeat grew irregular, as the darkness in the cell seemed to seep into my body and mind. I tried to pray. The words of the Imperial creed came haltingly, fragments remembered from a lifetime of rote recitation. "The Emperor protects," I whispered into the darkness. "In his name, let none survive." The irony was not lost on me. The Emperor had not protected me. He had not saved me from capture or torture or this slow death in an alien hell. But perhaps that was not the point. Perhaps the creed was not a promise of individual salvation but a statement of collective purpose. The Emperor protected humanity as a whole, even if individual humans suffered and died in darkness. My death meant nothing, but humanity continued. The Imperium endured, and that had to be enough. My vision was narrowing, the already dark cell becoming darker still. I felt cold, a deep, bone-deep chill that no amount of warmth could touch. My body was shutting down, systems failing one after another in a cascade of collapse. I wondered what came after death. The Imperial creed promised that faithful souls joined the Emperor at the Golden Throne, that they served him in death as they had served in life. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to think that some part of me would escape this place, would find peace or purpose in some afterlife beyond the reach of the Drukhari. But I had seen too much, experienced too much suffering, to maintain that kind of faith. More likely there was nothing, just the cessation of consciousness, the final escape into oblivion. The screaming from other parts of the complex seemed to be growing louder, or perhaps my hearing was becoming more acute as other senses failed. I could pick out individual voices in that chorus, hear the specific notes of their agony and despair. Somewhere a woman was calling out a name over and over, probably seeking a lost child or loved one. Somewhere a man was laughing, the sound having crossed over from sanity into madness. Somewhere something that might have once been human was making sounds that should not have been possible for a human throat to produce. They would continue screaming long after I was gone. New prisoners would arrive to replace me. The Drukhari would continue their raids across the galaxy, capturing and torturing and consuming for centuries or millennia more. My death changed nothing. I felt my heart stutter, miss beats, struggle to maintain its rhythm. Any moment now, I thought. Any moment the final darkness would arrive and I would be free. I tried to summon one last image from my life before, something pure and untainted to carry with me into oblivion. I thought of the grain fields at sunset, the way the wind would make patterns in the wheat, like waves on an ocean. I thought of my wife's hand in mine as we walked from the chapel after our wedding, calloused fingers interlaced with mine, both of us smiling foolishly in our best clothes. I thought of my daughter as an infant, the weight of her in my arms, the way she would grasp my finger with surprising strength and make small, contented noises while she slept. The images came clear and sharp, more vivid than any memory I'd had in months or years. For a moment I was back there, back home, back in the life that had been stolen from me. I could smell the grain dust and the incense from the chapel. I could feel the warmth of the sun on my face and my wife's hand in mine. I could hear my daughter's infant breathing, that slight whistle through her tiny nose that had always made me smile. It was real, more real than the cell around me, more real than the pain in my failing body. I clung to it, dove into it, let it fill my consciousness until there was room for nothing else. The darkness took me, or perhaps I took the darkness, embraced it, welcomed it as a long-delayed friend. My heart stopped its struggling, my lungs drew one final breath and let it out slowly. The pain that had been my constant companion for so long suddenly ceased, and in its absence there was a kind of peace I had forgotten existed. I felt myself floating, drifting, consciousness separating from the meat that had housed it. The screaming faded. The smell of the cell faded. Everything faded except those memories, those few precious moments from a life that had been ordinary and good and mine. I do not know if there is an afterlife. I do not know if the Emperor gathers the faithful to his throne, or if we simply dissolve into nothingness. But in those final moments, as the last electrical impulses fired in my dying brain, I knew that I had won the only victory available to me. I had endured, I had resisted, I had kept some small part of myself safe and intact, despite everything the Drukhari had done to me. They had consumed my body and tormented my mind, but they had not taken everything. That small room inside me, that core of self, remained mine until the very end. Perhaps that is all any of us can hope for in this cruel galaxy. Not salvation or justice or revenge, but simply the ability to die as ourselves, to maintain our humanity in the face of powers that seek to strip it away. The Imperium grinds up billions of lives in service of survival. The Drukhari torture millions for their pleasure and sustenance. The galaxy itself is hostile to human existence in ways both subtle and overt. But we endure, we persist, and sometimes, in our final moments, we can claim the smallest of victories. I was Sergeant Matthias Kane of the PDF, Agri World 17, second-born son of agricultural workers, husband, father, faithful servant of the Emperor. I lived 73 years before my capture, and perhaps weeks or months after. I suffered as few humans suffer. I died alone in darkness, far from home. But I died as myself, and in the end, that was enough. The darkness is absolute now. The memories have faded. The pain is gone. Whatever comes next, oblivion or service or something stranger, I face it without fear. The Drukhari could not break me. They could destroy my body and torment my mind, but they could not consume the essential spark of what made me human. That spark persisted until the end, and perhaps it persists still, in whatever exists beyond death. The Emperor protects, not always in the ways we expect or hope, not always in ways that spare us from suffering or death, but in the end, in that final accounting, perhaps that is enough. The Imperium endures, humanity continues, and the darkness, for all its power and cruelty, does not win every battle. Sometimes we resist. Sometimes we maintain our dignity and humanity despite everything. Sometimes the prey shows teeth. I am dying. I am dead. I am beyond death. The words lose meaning as consciousness fragments and disperses. But somewhere in whatever passes for my awareness now, I hold fast to those memories, those moments of simple human joy from a life that feels like it belonged to someone else. The grain fields, the wedding, the infant's weight in my arms, they are mine, and no one can take them from me now. Not the Drukhari, not the darkness, not even death itself. This is what it is like to be captured by the Dark Eldar. This is the reality behind the whispered warnings and horror stories. This is the fate that awaits those unlucky enough to draw their attention, to be in the wrong place when their raiding parties emerge from the webway. We are nothing to them. We are less than nothing. We are food, entertainment, raw material to be processed and discarded. Our lives have no meaning except what meaning we can claim for ourselves in those final moments. But meaning exists nonetheless. Resistance exists. Humanity persists. And even here, even in the darkest corner of the darkest city in the galaxy, even in my final moments as consciousness drains away, I remain human. I remain myself. I remain Matthias Kane. And that will have to be enough. The screaming continues somewhere far away. New prisoners arrive. The eternal cycle of suffering grinds on. Commorragh feeds. The Drukhari laugh and feast, and plan their next raids. The galaxy spins through the void, uncaring, hostile, vast beyond comprehension. But I am free now. I have escaped. They can do no more to me. The darkness holds no more terrors. I float in it like floating in warm water, letting go of everything except those precious few memories, holding them close as treasures more valuable than all the gold and power in the Imperium. Let them come. Let the Drukhari raid other worlds and capture other prisoners. Let them torture and kill and consume. They cannot touch me now. I am beyond their reach, beyond pain, beyond fear. I am going home, in whatever way that is possible. I am returning to the grain fields and the sunset and the simple pleasures of a simple life. I am with my wife and daughter again, in memory if not in flesh, and that is victory enough. This is what it means to die in darkness far from home. This is what it means to suffer at the hands of creatures who have made cruelty into an art form. This is what it means to resist, however futilely, against powers that cannot be defeated by any human strength. This is what it means to be human in a galaxy that is hostile to humanity. We suffer, we endure, we resist, and in the end, when death finally comes as mercy, we hold fast to whatever small piece of ourselves we have managed to protect. I am Sergeant Matthias Kane. I was a prisoner of the Dark Eldar. I suffered, I resisted, I died, and I won.